25% reduction in federal spending. That was in the Democratic Party platform of 1932, on which Franklin Roosevelt ran. If you look at the rhetoric that the Roosevelt-Garner team used against the Hoover administration, you'll find the kind of, it sounds like it came from Bumper Hornberger at the Future of Freedom Foundation. Roosevelt says that Hoover was presiding over the greatest spending administration in peacetime history. He assailed him for jacking up taxes and tariffs and choking off trade. His running mate, John Nance Garner from Texas, actually used this phrase. He said, "Hoover is leading the country down the path to socialism." Now, how does that square with what you might have learned in your history books, say, in high school? Almost all of us have gone through courses where they talk about Hoover was the laissez-faire, hands-off, didn't do anything president. He just sat back. The economy of its own weight fell apart, and he didn't do anything to lift us out of it, and then Franklin Roosevelt had to save us from the Great Depression. Well, I hope I've so far answered at least part of that myth, that Hoover was not a laissez-faire president. And you don't have to take my word for it. Take Franklin Roosevelt's word for it. So that's what I would urge you to do when you run into somebody who makes that claim, and if they're a big FDR advocate, quote FDR for them and say, well, how do you square that with what he said? He said Hoover was leading the country down the path to socialism. Well, FDR, of course, wins in a landslide in 1932. He comes in March of 1933 and becomes very quickly a virtual economic dictator. By virtue of the fact that the country is desperate for answers, he gives great speeches, soothing to the country, and the Congress doesn't know what to do. He's obviously want a mandate. What does he want to do? Let's let him do it. And so the first 100 days of the Roosevelt administration, we get the inauguration of the New Deal. That leads me now to the third phase of the Great Depression, the phase of the New Deal. Third phase. This explains why a depressed situation now gets a little worse and then continues to linger for much of the rest of the decade. Okay? The phase of the New Deal. The New Deal embraces a lot of stuff. And it's not just legislation, it's also the rhetoric from the new administration, which is almost continually anti-enterprise, anti-business. That even picks up and gets more virulent in the second Roosevelt term. But the legislation that was passed had real, tangible, far-reaching, and deep ramifications, harmful for the economy. And there are two pieces of legislation in particular I want to zero in on. Two that I think bear the blame for taking this bad situation and keeping it bad, making it a bit worse in 33 and 34. The first one is the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, passed within the first 100 days in 1933. This was prompted by the Roosevelt administration's theory that there was too much competition in the American economy. We have plummeting prices. That seems to hurt. Everybody likes their prices to be up, and yet they keep going down. Well, of course they are. You've choked off trade with Smoot-Hawley. You've got the Fed contracting the money supply. Markets are plunging all over the world. But the thought that this was due to excessive competition and that the answer was to stifle competition was absurd. And here's what it led them to do. The National Industrial Recovery Act attempted to cartelize or monopolize industries, try to get industries singing out of the same hymn book in terms of their prices and their practices. It imposed price controls, codes, and other regulations designed to keep prices up. There's a famous case I referred to in the essay of a man named Jack Magid from New York City, as I recall, who was prosecuted under the NRA he was a tailor. He pressed a suit of clothes for the price of 35 cents in violation of the NRA code, which was 40 cents. Now think of it, we're in the midst of a depression. You're lucky if you got a suit of clothes, let alone the money to have it pressed. And here's a guy who says, I'll press your clothes for 35 cents. He goes to jail because the government says, he should have charged you 40. And that's a prescription for recovery? But in a microcosm, that is what the NIRA was attempting to do across the board throughout the economy. They put a guy in charge of it by the name of General Hugh Iron Pants Johnson. That was his nickname, Iron Pants. He was a professed admirer of Benito Mussolini. Mussolini hadn't yet made the headlines that he would make later in the decade that would cause us all to despise him. He hadn't yet invaded Ethiopia, things like that. But he had a reputation already as a strong man who was going to order the economy to recover and make the trains run on time and so forth. And this was something that Iron Pants Johnson liked. Hey, we're in a depression. We just got to tell people, you're going to do this, you're not going to do that, and we will order our way or parade our way out of the depression. They had parades down Main Street America with flags. They had the symbol for the NRA, the National Recovery Administration that the NIRA set up. The symbol for it was the Blue Eagle. And the administration tried to whip up patriotic sentiment, you know, hey, if you're with the administration, you're for America, and you should carry flags and banners and stick the Blue Eagle in your window to show solidarity with the New Deal attempt to get us to recover. All this did was to raise the costs of doing business. One guy's price is another man's cost. And by decree, preventing competition, preventing prices from going down, all you did was raise the costs of doing business. By some estimates, as much as 40% across the economy. Some industries like housing and construction, probably even more. This is not a prescription for recovery, and yet that's what it was sold as. It contributed to the continued decline in the economy by preventing adjustments and raising the costs of doing business. But if you think that was something, the other piece of New Deal legislation I want to focus on, if you haven't heard of this, will raise your eyebrows even more. And that is the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Okay, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Don't you love the names that they give these things? It can be the most harmful thing to come down the pike, but they come up with these high-sounding names. National Industrial Recovery. Who can be opposed to that? Agricultural Adjustment Act. Agriculture needed adjustment. No question about it. It was in the tank. And this did adjust agriculture. I like to say that it adjusted agriculture just like falling out of an airplane will adjust your neck. Here's what it did. It levied a new tax on agriculture. Boy, there's an innovative idea. You take a depressed industry and tax it more, and that'll help us recover. Levied a new tax on agricultural processors in particular like millers and refiners, and used the revenue to pay for programs to destroy perfectly healthy cattle, sheep, and pigs by the millions, and to plow under perfectly good, healthy fields of crops like corn, wheat, cotton, and so forth. There's a famous line, I don't recall to whom it was attributed, but a farmer who talked about how difficult it was. He had trained his mules to walk between the rows. But now under the AAA, he had to train the mules to stomp on the crops, not to walk between the rows, but to walk on the rows. And the mules didn't want to do it. It was very hard to get them to change, which, what does that say about the relative intelligence of mules versus Congress at the time? The mules had it right. Well, in one particular order, by the way, Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace issued in one particular order, he ordered the destruction of 6 million baby pigs under the AAA. 6 million of them. They weren't sick. It was because we were trying to reduce the supply so as to raise the price. The theory being if farmers get a higher price, of course they're selling less, but if they get a higher price, then they'll make more money. And they'll spend it on fertilizer or what have you, and that'll help the economy recover. But even if it had helped the farmer, it could have done so only at the expense of everybody else. This is redistribution through destruction. And I wish I could stand before you as an economist and say, aha, here's a way to prosperity or to economic recovery in bad times. You just destroy things of value. I wish I could stand here and tell you, yeah, that works, let's do that. Because it's easy to do. Government is an expert at it. It doesn't take much brains. The hard part is creating the stuff in the first place. Destroying it, you can have a lot of fun with that. But it is not synonymous with economic recovery or productivity or growth or solving problems in a depressed economy. This is an interesting time period for a lot of reasons, but I'll just parenthetically, I'll mention that something else happened about this time, and it wasn't me who first explained this, but I can't recall who it was, who pointed out how times had changed so dramatically in the course of a year that Roosevelt was doing all this stuff. And it had to do with the repeal of prohibition and the seizure of gold.